most recent season of The Boys has dropped, so it's time to review it. For a frame of reference, I have watched the previous 3 seasons, but I have not watched Gen V or Diabolical. If you want to know my thoughts on seasons 1 and 2, I have reviews of them on my channel. Full warning, I will be spoiling this season as well as the previous 3 seasons. Without further ado, let's get started. Let's start with the plot. Overall, I thought this season's plot was much weaker than the previous 3. For one, this season's plot meanders way too much. There are way too many subplots that stunt the pacing of the season as a whole. I typically don't mind subplots as long as they're interesting and they don't take away from the main plot line, but the vast majority of the subplots here are just not compelling. And on top of that, the social commentary this season is much less nuanced and well thought out than in previous seasons. While it still critiques things like capitalism, commercialism, and the alt-right, it does so in a much more simplistic way. Let's look at the opening episode. So the opening sequence of this season is actually pretty solid. It does a good job reintroducing the characters, defining the main conflict, and setting up the main plot. However, the middle chunk of this episode introduces most of the season's main problems. For one, the commentary and satire is way too on the nose. It used to be much more nuanced and subtle. On top of that, there are way too many subplots. The subplots about Frenchie's romance with the one guy and MM's conflict with his daughter both should have been cut. Moving on to episode 2, the scenes where Butcher and MM argue felt really repetitive. The conflict between Butcher and the rest of the boys regarding Butcher's vendetta against Homelander feels really played out. On top of that, the scenes involving the alt-right rally are just pure cringe. This show's never really figured out how to critique religion, and this episode is a prime example of that. However, on the positive side, I did really like the scene where Firecracker reveals to Sage that she gathers her followers by offering them purpose. It does a good job reflecting how extremists prey on the lonely and directionless and offer them purpose and mission. Also, the Boys versus Firecracker and Splinter fight was fun. It does a good job utilizing its TV budget to provide some fun action. Lastly, this episode also marks the start of A-Train's redemption arc, which is one of the highlights of the season. Moving on to episode 3. While the scenes between Butcher and Ryan are not necessarily bad, they feel really played out. How many times can we see Ryan change his allegiance from Butcher to Homelander and back and forth? I'm also not really a fan of Firecracker's motivation for hating Starlight. It feels really out of character for Annie. I also felt like the storyline with Huey's mom was not very well executed. It feels like the show wants us to forgive her way too easily for doing something pretty terrible. This episode introduces a subplot about Kamiko being recognized by a member of the terrorist organization that kidnapped her as a child. And while the idea for this subplot isn't necessarily bad, it doesn't really go anywhere and it's never really resolved. And lastly, the scene where the ice skaters die is just a bit too goofy. Like, I understand how 1 or 2 of them could end up dying after getting caught in the crossfire, but the way it plays out is a little too Final Destination. On the positive side, I did enjoy the sequence where Huey and MM hatch a plot to spy on Homelander and Newman. It reminded me of kind of the planning and scheming scenes from the earlier seasons. Moving on to episode 4. So the Homelander plotline from this episode is one of the things that people are pointing to as kind of being one of the strong points of the season. However, I'm a little mixed on it. While yes, it is very well written and suspenseful, and I did like learning about why Homelander is the way he is, I feel that it lacks impact because we've seen Homelander do so many terrible things in the past. It's just kind of more of what we've seen before. I also didn't really care for how Frenchie's romance subplot wrapped up because I didn't really care for it in the first place. That being said, episode 5 was probably the strongest episode of the season. The sequence involving the Super Chickens and Super Sheep was awesome. Stuff like that is why people love this show. It's the perfect amount of creativity and extremism that this show is known for. I also enjoyed the subplot involving Huey's father because it felt like a very respectful and also satisfying way to kind of end the journey of a very prominent side character. I also kind of like the ending where Ashley tricked the Seven into killing her boyfriend because it shows how evil she's becoming. However, I didn't really care for the beat where Frenchie turns himself in because he feels guilty for what he's done, because I feel like this plotline should have been wrapped up last season. Then we get to episode 6, and episode 6 was absolutely repulsive. While this series has always had a bit of an edge to it, this episode takes it way too far. Having Huey be sexually abused and then playing it for laughs just feels off. While I don't necessarily mind raunchy humor when it's done well, this episode just felt like it was the writers trying to think of the most disgusting, extreme thing they could. Also, the ending scene where Newman tells all of the rich people that they know what's best and they should be put in charge of the country just felt so on the nose and blatant. I suppose I did kind of like the beat where A-Train saves because it was a solid stepping stone in his redemption arc. Episode 7 was okay. I did like the bit where Ryan tells off Vought and Homelander because it feels like it could be a solid stepping stone in his arc. I also liked the fight between the boys and the Deep and Black Noir too. However, I did feel that A-Train's redemption arc wrapped up a little bit too suddenly, and while I enjoyed seeing Frenchie and Kimiko reconcile, it feels like they've been through this arc before. However, I wasn't a fan of the plot beat where Huey sleeps with the shapeshifter, because that just felt off morally. It feels like this season's just trying to put Huey in the most disgusting moral situations possible. And the season finale was messy at the least. I did like the fight between Annie and the shapeshifter, and the way that Butcher kills Newman. However, I didn't like the twist that, oh, this was Sage's master plan the entire time. Way too many coincidences happened for that to be true. I also don't understand how Butcher has a new set of powers. I thought that Compound V only gave you one set of powers. Lastly, I really did not like how Ryan's story ended because it felt like he's gone back and forth between Butcher and Homelander way too many times. Let's move on to the characters. The main issue this season is that the character arcs either feel underdeveloped or repetitive, or both. The show either introduces a new subplot for a character and then doesn't resolve it, or just retreads plotlines from previous seasons. To start with Butcher, I feel that his storyline this season is really repetitive. It's yet another season of him struggling with his darker side and his hatred for superheroes. While Karl Urban is still good in the role, the writing for his character has gotten to the point where it feels very played out. And I don't know why the writers of this season just decided that they hate Huey all of a sudden. First they have his dad die, then they have him get sexually abused in a sex dungeon by an evil Iron Man, then he basically gets R-worded by a shapeshifter that's impersonating his girlfriend. And all the while, nothing really new was done with his character. I mean, I suppose he reconciles with his mom, but that's about it. And plastic surgery jokes aside, this season really does not do much with Annie. She really doesn't have very much character growth or development. MM's storyline feels incredibly repetitive. How many times can we see him argue with his ex-wife and his daughter? There's a subplot about his daughter having anger issues that's introduced and never goes anywhere. Frenchie's storyline is one of the worst and just overall strangest this season. It begins by establishing that he still feels guilty for the murders that he committed back when he was a hitman. I could have swore that we wrapped this plotline up a season or two ago, but okay, whatever. While this makes sense in universe, it still feels repetitive of his character development in the previous 3 seasons. I thought that his whole arc in the previous seasons was that he forgave himself for that. The show then introduces another love interest for him, even though the previous 3 seasons have very much been building up a relationship between him and Kimiko. Then they get rid of the love interest, have him turn himself in and get freed all over the course of like an episode or 2. And then him and Kimiko admit that they do want to be together and go off together. What? Speaking of, Kimiko's storyline is also very underdeveloped. Early on in the season, it's revealed that the terrorist organization that kidnapped her as a child is still active. So I thought, okay, her subplot is going to be her taking down this terrorist organization. However, there's only like 1 or 2 scenes of her actually doing that, and that's just kind of it. There's no real resolution to it. Moving on to the villains, in this season, Homelander pretty much just does more of the same. He tortures and kills people who aren't loyal to him, intimidates other supes into doing his bidding, and tries to brainwash Ryan into being just like him. While Antony Starr is still fantastic and brings a lot of character to the role, his storyline just feels like more of the same. A-Train is the one character who actually has a fair amount of growth this season. They actually give him a solid redemption arc that was set up in the previous season, and I'm excited to see where his character goes in the final season. Even A-Train's story feels like there's a few beats missing from it. I wish there was more of a moment where he definitively decided to be good. The Deke does continue to be a fun side character also. The actor that plays him is hilarious, and his arc really complements A-Train's as he kind of goes the opposite direction and becomes more loyal to Homelander. Black Noir 2 is also kind of a fun addition to the cast. The recurring joke of him being clueless is actually pretty funny, and they do a good job not overplaying it. Firecracker was also a fun new addition to the cast. I like how she kind of slowly manipulates Homelander into turning on Sage and becoming more loyal to her. Speaking of, Sage is complicated. She's supposed to be the smartest person in the entire boys universe, but the show tries way too hard to make her seem like impossibly smart. There are several times when things happen in a way that are far too specific to have been pre-planned. The actress does do a good job though, and I think her dynamic with the Deep is funny. I just wish the show portrayed her intelligence with more nuance. I've never really been a fan of the Newman character. She always kind of felt like a subplot that was given way too much attention. She isn't a very compelling villain, and her goals aren't particularly well defined. The actress does fine, and her death is pretty cool, but she's just not a super compelling villain. Ashley's character arc this season is kind of all over the place. At first you think she may be trying to leave Vought because she's becoming so disgusted with who they are and what they've done. Then she gets intimidated and decides not to leave Vought out of fear for her life. Then she kind of takes advantage of how evil Vought is to get what she wants. And then she realizes that Vought doesn't really care about her after Homelander orders her killed. I mean, maybe if she has powers next season, she'll be more interesting, but as of right now, she's just kind of eh. Ryan's storyline is good in concept, but very poorly executed. I just don't buy that he'd be as loyal to Homelander as this season presents him to be. I do like the idea of him slowly realizing how evil Homelander and Vought are and leaving, but the season doesn't really fully commit to that. And lastly, Kessler does kind of serve his purpose as the devil on Butcher's shoulder, although I saw it coming a mile away that he was not going to be real. I kind of wish that they didn't waste an actor as good as Jeffrey Dean Morgan on kind of a throwaway character. So to conclude, this season is by far the weakest season of The Boys so far. They take a lot of the problems that I had with the previous 3 seasons and expand on them. While there are a few highlights like A-Train's redemption arc, the sequence with the superpowered farm animals, and the episode where Homelander goes and kills the scientists, most of the plot lines here feel very underdeveloped. I think I'm gonna have to give it a negative review. So that's it, those are my thoughts. What were your thoughts on the 4th season of The Boys? Do you agree with me or did you actually like it? I'll put the links to my reviews of the first 2 seasons right here. If you want to see more TV reviews, click this playlist right here, or right here, wherever it is. As per usual, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe and like this video. Bye.